we have brought together some experts in historic preservation who are going to show you and tell you how important it is and how it can be done. And I'm excited to be introducing them. Our first speaker will be Donovan Rypkema. He is a recognized industry leader in the economics of preserving historic structures. He has a master's in historic preservation from Columbia University, and he has spent over 40 years providing consulting services in 49 states and 20 countries on economic and preservation issues related to rehabilitation, community development, and commercial revitalization. Donovan, we're excited to have you.
Thank you all. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to get started in a minute, but I have to have a timeout first. When we were talking about my coming down here for this, Linda and Luis and I talked about subjects we could talk about, and I said, well, you know, I can talk about that national data that we've discovered, and I'm going to share that with you. But I said, to tell you the truth, I don't have a comfort level of intervening in local issues without having a better understanding of the local context, that I just would be overreaching to pretend I knew something, to say, this is a good idea, that's a bad idea. I won't do that because I don't know enough. And that hasn't changed except for this, is that between our afternoon session and when we came back here tonight, we walked around and drove around downtown. I've been in Aiken before, and it's an extraordinary place. I didn't realize how extraordinary on multiple levels that this place is as a community, with these parkways that go, I mean, Chris talked about them in his presentation. You'll hear it from him, and you all know it. I've never seen anything like that. I go to 100 towns a year, and I've been doing this for 40 years. I've never seen anything like that. Wonderful context that frames your city and creates this core. And then this downtown, that in terms of compact, intact, quality buildings. Now, every one of them is not an architectural gem, but that's not the point. You have this incredible collection of commercial activities, and then this connection of the cultural traditions. The C.C. Johnson drugstore on the corner is a fabulous story that needs to be part of the evolution of this. And it's not that every building ought to be saved because it belongs on the cover of Architectural Digest. Is not true. It's just the character and quality comprehensiveness of what is irreplaceable. It is irreplaceable. And I'm not a preservationist at all who says that nothing should ever be torn down. I don't believe that. Sometimes it comes. But here's what you have to understand, that in real estate, and I come from the real estate world, in real estate, the biggest variable for success is to maintain as much flexibility for as long as possible. When you have a building standing, you got three things you can do with it. You can do nothing, you can fix it up, you can tear it down, and all three of those options always exist until you tear it down, and then all have disappeared. So it's not that nothing should ever be torn down, but you need to think really hard about that being the last resort, because what you have here, and I hate being nice to people, so I'm getting this out of the way, that what you have here in Aiken is really extraordinary. And it would be a shame for you, but really for the rest of us as well, to kind of lose this incredible thing that you have. So now I'm done being nice. You don't have to worry about that again. I'm done with it. So I'm a numbers geek guy. Our firm mostly does statistical analysis on the impacts of preservation, and mostly what you're going to hear from me is a bunch of number stuff and graphs, and the good news is I can't see you out there, so you can doze off. I won't even know it. Just keep the snoring down a bit if you would, but that's all. So it may seem like the eternal economic seminar, and that might seem like hell, but that's the way it's going to be. So a few years ago, we had an assignment to do an analysis of the state historic tax credit in Pennsylvania. And we were about 80% done with the study. It wasn't quite repeated yet, but Mindy Crawford, our client there, ran the statewide preservation organization. She said, could you come, we're having a meeting in Harrisburg of a bunch of our members, and could you come up and just give us kind of a sneak preview of what you're finding so far? And I said, sure, I'm happy to do that. So I went up and gave a presentation. Here's what we've learned, and told them about it. And the next day, I got an email from somebody who had been at the conference, and he said, I enjoyed your short presentation at Preservation PA the other afternoon. It was as interesting as the topic would allow. So my threshold now is interesting as the topic would allow. But I thought that was a clever thing to say, so I put it on our Facebook page. And the next day, I got a suggestion on how to improve our product, and it was this. Now, my staff hasn't allowed me to actually do it with any of our reports, but I'm tempted. It might help. So much of what you're going to hear is from studies that we've done on the city level in the last 4 or 5 years. Big cities, New York, Los Angeles, San Antonio, kind of mid-sized places, Indianapolis, Raleigh, Miami, and then smaller places, Cumberland, Maryland, and Saratoga Springs, New York. So I've just kind of pulled out factoids from mostly those places to share with you about this broad impact of historic preservation. But I know that all of you came here tonight so that you could understand the meaning of this graph. And so I'm going to be spending the next 35 minutes talking about what this graph means. Well, there's a concept in economics called revealed preference. And it's looking at what the marketplace does that reveals their preference. And this is the graphic representation of the mathematics of revealed preference. But I have a better way to explain it to you. And it's this. Is that if I were to ask you all, I would say, how many of you prefer chocolate ice cream? And a bunch of you raise your hands. And I'd say, okay, how many of you prefer vanilla ice cream? And a bunch of others would raise their hand. Well, that's stated preference. You raised your hand and you said, I prefer chocolate ice cream. Or Linda could roll in some carts in here with a bunch of ice cream cones, some of them chocolate, some of them vanilla, and you'd simply take one. You'd take the one, and that's revealing your preference. You didn't have to say, I like vanilla better. You took a vanilla cone. So much of our analysis is in the revealed preference, what the marketplace is saying about its preference to live in, to invest in, to work in historic buildings and historic districts. So that's mostly what you're going to hear from me tonight. But I want to start with this issue of jobs. We're called a historic preservation firm, and I guess we are, but we're really in the business of economic development. And in economic development, at the core of it all, and that's about jobs. You don't have to like cornices and gargoyles to understand the importance of historic preservation in your community. You can only care about jobs, and it makes a lot of sense. And here's the reason why. As a rule of thumb in the United States, in new construction, half of the money goes to labor, half the money goes to materials. But in rehabilitation, 60 to 70% goes to labor, the balance goes to materials. That has a huge difference on the local economic impact of that activity. And think of it this way. A plumber installs a sink, and the sink doesn't spend any more money, but the plumber does. He or she goes and gets a haircut, goes to the movie, pays the rent, buys groceries, and that dollar recirculates in the local community. There's no more circulation of dollars from the sink, but there is from the plumber. So this is this issue of labor intensity. So in the United States as a whole, every time there's 100 jobs in new construction, there's another 135 jobs created somewhere else in the economy. That's good. That's a multiplier effect. But when there's 100 jobs in rehabilitation, there's 186 jobs elsewhere in the economy. That's this labor intensity, job creation, local job creation activity. So when you spend $100 on labor in new construction, $145 of labor income is generated someplace else in the economy. But spend $100 in rehabilitation, and in fact, it's $174. So if the only thing you care about is more money in our local economy, rehabilitation is a vastly better decision than new construction consistently. But it's not just in the construction phase of historic preservation. We did a study in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles doesn't have very many local commercial historic districts. In California, what we all call local historic districts, they call HPOZs, Historic Preservation Overlay Zones. So when you see that, that's basically a local historic district. Well, not very big, but there are some. But the point is, here's a vibrant economy in Los Angeles, and yet both the rate of job growth in both local historic districts and National Register districts vastly greater than what is in the rest of the city in a vibrant economy. Here's Nashville. Maybe an overheated economy, but certainly doing great, and the 40% job growth in the local historic districts when the rest of the city has a job growth of 9%, vastly more. And then, of course, the issue of downtown revitalization. An area where we do, at least in the past, a lot of work. We did a study in the state of Arkansas, where they have a great state Main Street program, and looked at the life of that program, and that's meant $337 million in capital investment, 78% of which came from the private sector, 3,900 net new jobs, 1,100 net new businesses, and half of those towns, Main Street towns in Arkansas, in fact, are small places, less than 10,000 people. Now, this one is only for the numbers geekiest of you. Federal government's good for some things, not so good for other things, but one of the things it's really good at is keeping track of numbers. And one of the numbers that they keep track of is the relationship between the number of businesses that start every year and the number of businesses that close. Okay, how many opened, how many closed? And over the long haul, that averages usually someplace between 1.1 and 1.2 to 1. That is 11 or 12 businesses open for every 10 that close. And of course, you have to have more businesses opening than closing, or you have a declining economy. So there you can see the numbers, and then you see it 2008, 2009, when we were in the Great Recession. There were numbers below 1, meaning more businesses closed than open, and then it comes back to more normal things. So those are the U.S. numbers. There are the Arkansas numbers. So they have a few times where their peak is a little higher, a few times when the valley's a little lower, but largely the same curve. And then there's Arkansas Main Street communities. And again, Main Street is economic development in the context of historic preservation. That's what Main Street is, and that's their numbers. That even, it's not that they weren't suffering when there was recessions and go up and down, but every year in the worst of years, in fact, they were opening far more businesses than they were closing in that preservation-based downtown revitalization strategy that's Main Street. But it's not just Main Street. In Raleigh, again, a vibrant local economy, state capital, middle research triangle, 5 great universities around it, and a very vibrant with lots of new construction in their downtown. Now, I have to admit, I'm a kind of market economy guy. I believe in business, but I don't care about the big guys. The big guys can take care of themselves. I kind of care about small business, what is happening to small businesses and new businesses. So we looked at where those new businesses that came into downtown Raleigh, where they went. Well, almost half of them, 46%, went to historic buildings in downtown Raleigh. Not the new high-rises, they went to historic buildings. Another 20% went to older buildings that just weren't, designated yet. So this market choice of being in historic buildings of small and new businesses. Oh, and then I have everyone that, I've been working in this longer than any of my staff have been born. So that's how old I am and how young they are. But they're always pushing me to try new methodologies. So one of the things we did in Raleigh was to look at Yelp preferences. What were people's favorite restaurants based on Yelp? Well, 9 out of the 20, almost half of all of them were, in fact, all of restaurants in Raleigh, half of the most favorite were in historic buildings. Meaning it's more than just the prime rib that you're liking there. It's the character, the quality, the context that building represents. And then heritage tourism. Now again, I want to put it in context. Heritage tourism, positive impact, and I'll talk about some of those. My goal in life, and I got to reach it soon because I'm getting real old, but my goal in life is when you say economics and historic preservation in the same sentence, that the default response is not, oh, you must mean heritage tourism. It certainly is one, it's just not remotely the only one. But here's some examples. Here's San Antonio, home of the Alamo, has now a UNESCO World Heritage Site of the 9 Spanish missions, including the Alamo. And so we looked at tourism data for San Antonio and divided that between heritage visitors and then people who came to San Antonio and didn't care about any heritage stuff. And we looked at the propensity of them to stay overnight. Some of you may be in the tourism business, but we like visitors of all kinds, but the one with the greatest by far economic impact on the community is the overnight visitor. Something around 60%, when you're on vacation, around 60% of everything you spend in a day is going to be spent in whatever town you spent overnight. And so the attraction of overnight visitors is particularly important. So lots higher rate of overnight visitors among heritage visitors than in visitors in general. And when you're on vacation, you basically spend all of your money in 5 categories. You spend it on lodging, you spend it on restaurants, you spend it on retail purchases, you spend it on local transportation, and here's why that's sorted out, that I live in Washington, D.C., if you fly up to Washington on American Airlines, that doesn't get counted as part of Washington's tourism impact because the money on American Airlines went to Dallas or whatever. But when you take the Uber, the taxi, the metro system, whatever, that does. So local transportation, and then finally admissions, entertainment, the other kinds of other stuff you do on vacation. Well, not only do heritage visitors spend more overall, they spend more in every one of those categories. So the restaurateur, the hotel owner, everyone gets more dollars when it's heritage visitors that they're catering to. Then in Nashville. Now there's a concept, and many of you know this, some of you don't, it's kind of a geeky thing, but in historic preservation, there's talk about tangible heritage, and that's like stuff you can touch, like buildings, and the intangible heritage, that's more culture, traditions, celebrations, festivals, whatever that is. In Aiken, there's a great intangible heritage of the whole equestrian tradition here. That's a great heritage. I guess you can touch the horses, but the whole concept you can't touch, but that's a real important intangible heritage that goes with the tangible heritage. Well, of course, in Nashville, one of the great music cities in the world, their intangible heritage is music. Well, it happens that Nashville had great tourism data that we were able to sort and look at. Well, there was this extraordinary connection between people who were heritage visitors who came for the heritage of Nashville disproportionately utilized the intangible heritage of the music. They went to more music venues, more music events. They were motivated more by music. So it's this intersection in Nashville of the built heritage of the historic buildings and the intangible heritage of the music. I'd suggest there's lots of those connections here between your built heritage and this wonderful intangible heritage of the equestrian world. A few years ago, I read a study from Norway that looked at what happened to heritage visitors' dollars when they went to visit a heritage site, and the question was, how much did that historic site get of their expenditure? Well, next to nothing, 7 to 10%. So I said, we ought to look at that. We'll steal their methodology, look at that somehow. And so we did a statewide study in Utah and found the same thing. Now, Utah is a big state geographically, a couple large cities, but most of the little towns, many of which have historic resources. That those historic resources were the magnet that brought visitors to those towns, but that historic resource wasn't who got the money. It was the restaurant, the gas station, the hotel, and others. So the point is these heritage resources can be who brings the dollar in, even though everybody else is really the beneficiaries of that activity. And then property values. I've been at this a long time, and I have to say, when I started out, the consistent response when somebody is trying to create a local historic district, consistent often from the real estate world, and I'm not picking on them because that's the world I come from, but they'd say, we don't want that stupid local historic district. It's going to be one more hoop to go through if we want to make any changes. Ergo, if there's one more hoop, it's going to hurt property values. That was a consistent answer time after time after time. Well, this is the area of study that's been done more than any other in this heritage, historic preservation, economics world, by more people, more parts of the country, more methodologies, with the same answer. That's consistently the same answer, and that, in fact, buildings in historic districts do better than the market as a whole. Now, in the last decade, oftentimes the same human beings who 20 years ago said, we don't want that damn historic district, that's going to hurt my property values, are saying, we don't want that damn historic district, my property values are going to go up because I'm going to have to pay more taxes then. Same people. Well, Saratoga Springs, New York. I picked it for a couple of reasons. One, we'd done a study there that was mostly about property values. And second, I just think there's real similarities, actually, between Saratoga Springs and Aiken. The whole horse tradition in part, a lot of seasonal residency in both places, some significant chunks of wealth in both places. So I just think that there's lots of kind of comparisons. And so I just wanted to share you the numbers and property values that we learned from Saratoga Springs. So we started out saying, okay, what's the average value of a house in historic districts and not in historic districts? What's much more valuable? Historic districts. So we said, okay, but that might be deceptive. What is it per square foot? Much more valuable in historic districts than in the rest of the city. So we said, well, what about, maybe it's different by age, so we divided it by age, pre-1900, 1900, 1925, in every age category. Properties were more valuable in historic district than in the rest of the city. Victorian is their big choice of style, where much of the style of housing in Saratoga Springs. Well, Victorian houses are much more valuable if they're in a historic district than if they're not. And then we even said, well, what about the condition of the property? Maybe that, no, didn't matter if good, bad condition, properties in historic district were more valuable. This is revealed preference. Property values change because the marketplace is saying, I'm paying more for that. Now, some of you may serve on a preservation commission. I hate to break your heart. They're not paying the premium for the thrill of appearing before your goofy commission. They're paying the premium for the confidence that the lunatic across the street's not going to do something to his house that has an adverse impact on mine. Real estate value comes from its context, and the economic role of historic districts is to protect the context out of which emerges the values of individual properties. Related to this, but a really important one that nobody has paid any attention to, not HUD, not FHA, not the realtors, not the mortgage bankers. They should all be paying attention. Here we had this great recession of 2009 to 2011. For a vast majority of us, nearly all of whatever we accumulate as household, as family wealth, is our house. And millions of Americans all over America lost everything because they lost their house to foreclosure. So it seems to make sense, well, then we ought to see if there's patterns of where foreclosures took place. And we've now looked at, 35 or 40 cities of this foreclosure pattern. I'll just give you a couple. Here's Raleigh. Almost in the heart of the recession, almost one property in 10 in Raleigh faced foreclosure actions. The action in National Register districts was half of that, and in local districts, half of that. Here is San Antonio. Every single historic district, some of them quite wealthy, some of them quite the opposite of wealthy, didn't matter, that the foreclosure rates in every instance was lower than the foreclosure rate in the city as a whole. Now, here's my thesis about that. It's not that people living in historic districts never lose their job or get divorced or run their credit card bills up too much. I think the underlying it is this. Because even in weak markets, there's a latent demand for those great historic houses in historic districts. If I get myself in financial trouble, I in fact can get my property sold before it reaches that foreclosure stage. Huge difference, and every place we've looked, pattern's the same. Small businesses, again, I like business in general, but mostly I care about small businesses. So here is again in Saratoga Springs. In the historic districts in Saratoga Springs have 22% of all jobs, but 30-some% of small firm jobs and young firm jobs disproportionately choosing to be. Again, nobody's passing a local ordinance saying, hey, you got to put your business in a historic district. This is people making those choices themselves on where they want to be. Here is a San Antonio. And the purple areas are local historic districts. The green circles are concentration of jobs in firms, in small firms employing fewer than 20 people. And so it's not that all of those are in historic districts, but you can see the pattern that these businesses are concentrating in and near those areas where people want to be, in those local historic districts. Also true of startup businesses and young businesses. Again, Los Angeles doesn't have very many commercial historic districts. They only constitute about less than 2% of all the jobs, but over 4% of the jobs in startup businesses chose to be. Those startup entrepreneurs chose to be in historic districts. And here again is Nashville. The historic districts are only home to 3% of all the jobs, but they represented 11% of the job growth, 13% of startup jobs, 15% of small business jobs. Revealed preference to be in historic districts. Of those jobs, there's a particular concentration of jobs in the knowledge industries and the creative class. So here's the state of Rhode Island, entire state. We looked every place, small state, but we looked every place, and the historic districts in Rhode Island only are about less than 4% of all the jobs, but in professional, scientific, and technical services, educational services, other services, management of companies and enterprises, and importantly, arts, entertainment, and recreation, the creative class, all of which are overrepresented in those historic districts. And here is New York City. You can love New York, you can hate New York, but nobody can say it's not one of the most creative places in the world. In Manhattan, Manhattan has about 12.5% of all of the jobs, but information jobs, educational services, and almost a quarter of all of the creative class jobs in a creative city in Manhattan are in fact in historic districts. Then the issue about walkability. And one of the real strengths of Aiken, by the way, is walkability. But over the last 15 years or so, it's become a really major variable in all kinds of real estate decisions. I'm sure you all know this, but just in case you don't, go on your computer, type in walkscore.com, and type in any address in America, and it'll give you a walk score from 1 to 100. The higher the score, the more walkable it is. So again, we're now consistently looking at walk scores whenever we do these impact analyses. So this is Savannah, very walkable city, but every historic district has higher walk scores than does the city as a whole. Here is Raleigh, a city that is, as a whole, is automobile dependent, a low walk score, both National Register, excuse me, district and local district, significantly higher walk scores. Excuse me. Now, I don't know if you've had density debates in Aiken or not, but in much of America it's happening. And the argument goes like this, and it comes from the city planner, the infrastructure engineer, sometimes from the police department, the ambulance company, the whatever, and they're saying, look, if we're going to be efficient with taxpayers' money for these expenditures, we have to have density. Now, if this were a city council hearing, and I said, hey, I want to have more density in Aiken, I'd get booed by most of you. You'd say, if I wanted density, I'd move back to Manhattan. I want that stupid density. Well, I got to tell you, density really is important. But here's the truth about density. Every place we've looked, this happens to be Indianapolis, where is the greatest density in the city? It's not where there's 40-story condos. It's in historic districts. That's Indianapolis. Here is Los Angeles, a place not known for its density, but the local historic districts have a density twice as much as the rest of the city. Here is Raleigh. At the beginning of the 20th century, almost 7,000, 8,000 people per square mile, and then come the automobile, suburban sprawl, and that crash, so a very lower, much lower density. But here's what's true in Raleigh, that the local historic districts have a density twice that of the city as a whole. But it's density at a human scale. We don't have to be overpowered to have density. We have it like many of your neighborhoods, in fact, have in Aiken. Then the issue that's kind of emerged in the last decade or so is kind of new research in terms of historic preservation. It's important environmental responsibility. And, you know, when we tear stuff down, it goes someplace. It mostly goes to the landfill, and that has increasingly environmental and economic costs. So a little house, 2,000 square foot house in Los Angeles, tear it, throw it away, that means that 295 cubic yards of stuff goes in the landfill. You know, 84 tons of crap were thrown away because we said we can tear this down. Mike Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, said, I want to put New York City on the path to be the most sustainable and energy efficient city in the world. Good businessman that he is. He said, well, first thing we got to do is find out who's using energy. So he ordered this energy audit of tens of thousands of both residential and commercial buildings. This had nothing to do with historic preservation. He just said, I want to know who's using the energy, contrary to what environmentalists have been telling us for years. Oh, you got to get rid of those old buildings. They're big energy hogs, and, you know, they do blah, 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 blah. We need green gizmos instead. No. The buildings that use the least energy per square foot were the oldest buildings. Every decade that went forward, in fact, they're using more energy, not less. The idea that green gizmos are the solution is just inanity. And then neighborhood level diversity. It's another area of kind of myth busting, because lots of times around the country, preservation is saying, oh, those is accused of this, saying, oh, those historic districts are nice, kind of pretty, but that's for the rich white folks should live, and that's not for the most of us. Well, in fact, factually incorrect. Here, in fact, is Los Angeles, one of the most diverse cities in America. And we looked at the share by race of who lives in historic districts versus who lives in the city as a whole. Well, Asians, blacks, other, and much of that is, you know, Latino calling themselves, all have a greater representation in historic districts than they do in the city as a whole. The relatively underrepresented group in historic districts is white people. Here is San Antonio. Again, not a large black population, San Antonio, but a huge Latino population. And again, who lives in the historic districts is a virtual mirror of who lives in the city as a whole. Housing affordability. Again, a critical issue almost every place in America. And once again, historic preservation is often said, well, you guys are, you know, those property values are going to keep us, people are going to be priced out, and nobody who doesn't make a lot of money can afford to live there. Well, just factually incorrect. Here is Miami-Dade County, that the homeowners in the cost of home ownership, in fact, is less in historic districts than in the city as a whole. For renters, housing costs less in historic districts than the city as a whole. And then, of course, the related thing is gentrification. You get those historic districts, you're going to be forcing people out, and it's going to be all gentrified. Well, so we went and did a study in Los Angeles. And some guys way smarter than we were at USC and UCLA had done a 15-year gentrification study in Los Angeles. Here's the place where gentrification has taken place. And their map was all these pink neighborhood marks. So that's where gentrification took place. So we overlaid their map with local historic districts. And that's where the gridded spaces are. Almost no connection. Almost no correlation. Maybe 10% of the land area in the historic districts was in gentrifying area, and maybe 15% of gentrifying area was in historic district, but largely no relationship. So it's not that gentrification doesn't take place, it's just that historic preservation is the wrong villain to say this is the cause of gentrification. Just is not true. I live in Washington, D.C., and Washington and lots of cities to my north and northwest are cities that have declined in population over the years. And so I was curious about, okay, when those cities start growing again, where does that growth take place? So here's Philadelphia, city that lost population for 50 years. And I don't know, I teach a class up at Penn on Tuesdays in the spring, but I don't really know the city very well. I just take the train up, go teach my class, and go home. But when the last census came out, the earlier census, big headlines in the Philadelphia Inquirer, we've finally turned the corner. We've stopped the decline. We've grown again. Except they hadn't. The historic districts in Philadelphia grew. The rest of the city continued to lose population. Same thing in Washington. A city that declined in population for 50 years, then began in 2010, turn around, grow again. Disproportionate share of the growth took place in the historic districts. Well, often, you know, preservation is accused of being against growth or precluding growth from taking place or trying to freeze in amber, you know, neighborhoods, downtowns, whatever. In fact, the opposite is true. The historic preservation is often an attractor of growth. Here is in case of population. Miami, certainly growing in population, growing more in historic districts than in the rest of the county. Here is again the whole state of Rhode Island, and it's a state where there's almost no population growth, but nearly all that did take place took place in the historic district, 3 or 4% of the land area, but almost half of the growth that took place in those historic districts. Here again is Pittsburgh, another one of these kind of long-time declining cities. City population declined, population in historic districts grew. So I say to city council members and mayors and city managers in these declining cities, say, hey, if you're ever going to grow again, for God's sake, don't be tearing down the neighborhoods that will be the first attractors of people when they come back. Again, contrary to this idea that historic preservation is kind of a freezing tactic, really preservation allows cities to evolve. Here is Savannah, one of the great historic cities in America. Nobody can argue about that. And I think an impression that, ooh, they have all those regulations and nothing can happen and they freeze those historic districts. Well, we did a study in Savannah. In fact, more money was invested in new construction in historic districts than was invested in rehabilitation in historic districts. So historic preservation is not about denying change, it's about managing change and making sure that the change take place is appropriate to the character and quality of the city. Now, some of you may be from City Hall as elected officials or city staff or whatever, so tax generation is important. We got to fix potholes and pay teachers and pay cops. We got to pay things. Well, what happens is because of this value increment, there's a disproportionate share of the tax load that historic buildings carry. So this is in Saratoga Springs, where the assessed value in historic areas is twice that of the rest of the city. Here is Miami-Dade County. Again, the assessed value per acre decidedly greater for two reasons. One is this greater amount of density. You don't have stuff all spread out, and you have this value of the properties there. And then preservation as catalyst for other things taking place. One of my favorites is Rouse's Market in New Orleans. This isn't one of the cool neighborhoods in New Orleans. This is just a neighborhood in New Orleans. This is a former automobile dealership that sat empty for, I don't know, 25, 30 years. And then a guy bought it and built Rouse's Market in it, put a grocery, kind of high-end grocery store in it. So the chart is the building activity in this neighborhood in New Orleans between Katrina and Rouse's Market. Rouse's Market is where the star is. And so what you can see is nothing happened. Nothing, zero, zilch, nada happened for all that period until Rouse's Market. And then there was $100 million worth of private investment, mostly on vacant lots around it. And we talked to all the developers of those properties. Why did you develop here? Because of Rouse's Market. It was the use of the state and federal tax credits that rehabilitated the 1950s automobile dealership that really was the catalyst for hundreds of millions of dollars of private sector investment right there. And then another of my favorites is in inner city Baltimore. It was a vacant industrial building in an inner city neighborhood, was redeveloped as housing, mostly concentrated on teachers and other public servants, nurses, cops, whatever, as their marketplace. Well, that project took place, and then investment took place all around it. Again, population of the city continued to fall, population around Miller's Court raised. So I want to end, since economic geek speech, I want to end with one of the great American economists, John Kenneth Galbraith, and here's what he wrote. The preservation movement has one great curiosity. There is never retrospective controversy or regret. Preservationists are the only people in the world who are invariably confirmed in their wisdom after their fact. Thank you for being that wise, and thank you for having me.